Hello, everybody. Joining me today is Dcn Nicholas Kotar. He is an epic fantasy author, translator, teacher. He has published a Kickstarter that is very exciting about Russian fairy tales, and as well as being in the men's choir at a Russian monastery in the middle of nowhere, or maybe from cow country, as your newsletter indicates.
Yes,
Deacon Nicholas, so glad to be speaking with you again.
it's a great pleasure, Derek. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. I just got to say that meeting you in person was one of the highlights for me, at least at the
You're
the
very
Symbolic
kind.
World Summit.
It was a supremely strange experience, feeling like you knew all these people in the room, but realizing in the middle of a conversation that actually this is the first time you're speaking with them in person. This is such a strange thing that we have, this virtual first thing. I mean,
Yes.
it's kind of I think it's a tribute to the human spirit that we're able to make it work because I think our ancestors would think we're insane.
Yeah. Yeah, truly. It kind of felt like a deja vu, like
Yeah,
kind of in and out of deja vu, where it's like there was a certain level of familiarity, like, oh yeah,
yeah,
that's my friend that I just met in person for the first time. And then other times where I was like trying to meet the virtual face with like the
yeah.
in-person face.
No, it's like this, right? Because I've found myself thinking about all these people that I met for the first time, including Jonathan, with whom I've worked extensively with the past few years. I'd never met him in person. And like I'm talking to them and the thought keeps coming, I don't actually remember how it is that I got in contact with you the first time because it wasn't in an embodied human experience. It was some email or some mention or something. I don't even remember, right? Well, everybody will always remember the first physical encounter with the human being that they've had, the thing that causes the relationship to blossom. But here that doesn't even happen. It's so weird.
Very weird. And so you had the pleasure of being one of the speakers. However, one of my greatest regrets of that weekend was not
Yeah.
being able to attend your talk
I don't blame you.
because I don't know who came up with this, but they
It
had
was
like
it
these
was
parallel
stupid, but
tracks.
yeah.
Whereas like it's like how fair is that? That's like choosing like, okay, which parent you want to stay with this weekend.
Exactly. Exactly.
And
No,
so
I mean, and honestly, like everybody that came to my thing, I was like, I don't know why you came. I mean, I'm grateful, but Martin Shaw's over there. Like, I'm supposed to be there. It's just
yes,
me over
I
here.
I know at that point I made commitments to be there for Vesper Stampers
Yeah.
talk, and of course that was paired with Martin Shaw,
Yeah.
uh, which so maybe I'll give you a little glimpse into that room, and then maybe
Okay.
you can give me a glimpse into your room because
That
these were
sounds good.
happening in two rooms next to each other.
Yeah.
And so Vesper Stamper goes up there. She basically like her presentation just rings a gong for artists and is like, get to it. We have important work to do. This is
Yeah.
saving the world. Come on, let's go. You know.
That's awesome.
And then Martin Shaw, of course, it was story time, but then he was, kind of eliciting us into a deeper place beyond
Yeah.
like all of the, logo centric, like, let's talk about this and analyze AI or something. And he's like, how about we just get really good at telling stories that
Mhm.
captivates people's attentions and their hearts?
Yeah.
So it was almost like they were like she came in with the hard hand, he came in with the soft hand. It was like
It's
very,
the
very strategic
perfect
that they paired
combination.
those.
Yeah. No, I mean, and I'm sure that Jonathan knew what he was doing when he paired the two together. So,
Yeah.
yeah, that sounds like it sounds like I really missed out.
Well, likewise. So meanwhile, over on the other side of the wall, what was going on
Yeah,
the other side of
on
the
the other
room?
side of the wall, I was on a like a makeshift stage in the middle of a Greek gymnasium. And if anybody's Orthodox, they'll understand what a Greek gymnasium looks like. I mean, it's kind of fraying at the edges. It's a basketball gym. The hoops are like barely hanging onto the ceiling. They're gonna fall off any second. The sound is awful. It's just booming all over the place. And there's these, instead of bleachers, you just have these plastic metal chairs all over the place in front of this makeshift stage. And there's a light that's like blaring in my face. And so you get simultaneously the effect of being on stage because you're raised and there's a light, but you don't have that distance from the people that you normally would have on a stage, which is very important actually. That distance between performer and stage is a it's a lifeline for a lot of performers because if you're too
Mm.
close, it's an entirely different experience. So this was like neither the intimate storytelling session that Martin Shaw would do, nor was it like a proper lecture that you would have on a stage with. I think the
Mm.
Vesper and Martin got more of that experience. It was more of a stage with proper separation between
Mm.
the people and the performer. So
Maybe just
from
describe that a little bit more, Nicholas,
yeah
because I get like the intimate, like, okay, we're all, gather around, folks, let's tell a
yeah
story.
yeah
But then this, as far as like the lecture, like what is the dynamic and the energy that is a part of that platform as opposed to more of an intimate one.
Well, it allows you to be less dependent on the energy of the room.
Mm,
So it's and both ways have advantages and disadvantages. So if you're the kind of performer that can um, that either is working off of a script or is doing something that allows for there to be this, how do you say it? It's like you're on display for the
mm,
people to enjoy, as opposed to somebody who's in among them, taking part in a communal event.
mm.
Both things are important, and you need to have one. You need to have both in different contexts. But and I've done both. And the intimate one is where you can very much feed off the energy of the room, and you can tell what kind of things are landing and which things aren't. While
Ah,
the other one, you're worried less about it because it's more of a performance. So it's kind of, you do things that you've crafted beforehand, and you've worked out the kinks beforehand, and you're not as dependent on the energy of the room. You're kind of grabbing them and forcing them to come with you, whether they like it or not. Um, and this was something in the middle, and it was neither one nor the other. So it took a little bit of an adjustment period
mm.
for me at the beginning. Like I started to talk on stage, and people weren't reacting. Like they were still talking to each other because there was no
Oh,
proper introduction
oh
given.
no.
Yeah, so it was really strange. It was like the room didn't know what they're supposed to do. Like, are we an audience at a lecture, or are we participants in a storytelling event?
Right.
And it took a little bit of time for it to, which is okay. I mean,
Yeah.
chaos is great. My
I
my
bet you wish
student,
you would have had like a literal gong.
right? Yeah. Well,
We're
I
beginning
should have just
now.
started like singing or something, or like done
Yeah.
done like a deaconly exclamation of some kind, just to get
Yes.
but I was nervous, and Martin Shaw was on my right, sitting on a chair by himself over there, listening in with a little notebook. And I was like, oh man.
Yeah, no big deal.
No,
It's the
just
other guy
the
taking
just
notes.
the greatest living storyteller of our time. Yeah, no,
Yeah,
no big
truly,
deal.
truly. Yeah. So how
Uh,
about the content? What'd you end up sharing?
so it was an interesting thing. I didn't really know what I was gonna share when I was hired to be one of the speakers, and it didn't sound like the title was something that I could really riff off. I mean, I still think nobody really knows what the title of the summit actually means. Um,
Mm, hmm
it's because it's so abstract, and it can fit so many things inside it.
mm.
But I was at an event. I was invited to do an event down in Florida, another event in Florida in November. This was the art of the tamada, um, which has weird connections with the summit, because John Heers, who was the master of ceremonies at the summit, was the one who hosted the art of the tamada. It's as an event that was
Mm.
raising money for his foundation, First Things Foundation, which is a fantastic work that he does. And this was a very small, intimate event at a I guess you'd call it a 3-star resort on the Florida Keys. So
Okay.
it was very comfortable, it was very nice, but it wasn't particularly flash or anything. But it was an opportunity for people to learn how to feast,
Mm.
learn how to become a toastmaster, and learn how to participate in a proper Georgian feast where the toasts are being passed around the room over the course of several hours. But as part of the whole event, there were several speakers that talked about various topics related to the table as hospitality, table as communion, table as sacramental reality of some kind.
Mm.
There was a lecture about the history of wine. It was really interesting, but I thought, well, why don't I talk about hospitality? Just the idea of hospitality, because a lot of people don't really understand it and how to do it properly. It's not really deeply embedded in American culture how to be properly hospitable. And Americans are very friendly,
Hmm
and they don't, they will invite you to their home, but they don't have the long centuries of developing, like in the old country, where you have rituals involved with entering the home as a guest or preparing the home as a host. And these rituals they're semi-religious, and they're very connected with folk culture, including stories and fairy tales and various elements of the act of hospitality from both the perspective of the host and the guest. these are themes that pop up in all stories in various ways. So I thought this would be a really interesting way for me to talk about the fairy tales that I love to talk about, but through a much more focused lens. And
Mm.
I ended up coming to the event unprepared. John hears, if you ever listen to this, I'm sorry, but I spent a good half day of the actual event. My dear wife sacrificed beach time for the sake of me preparing for this. So she has,
Sacrifice.
I know, right? It's in the
Uh,
middle of November for somebody who lives in upstate New York. Yeah,
yeah, yeah, this is like
I have much to pay
crucial
for.
time. Oh
But
man.
I spent a long time there, kind of in the silence of no children, coming up with a speech that ended up landing very well, even
Mm.
though it was challenging to the people, because I talked about both the responsibilities of the host and guest in terms of personal hospitality, as in the hospitality of your home. But then I gave a whole second part of the speech that talked about the hospitality of the parish, and how both
Mm.
hosts, as in parishioners, and guests, people walking in, have very specific and very concrete roles that they have to play out. And then I proceeded to make everybody angry by saying that in American Orthodoxy, both the hosts and the guests generally get it wrong, and it ended up leading to a lot of interesting conversations. I didn't end up talking about the parish part at the Symbolic World Summit. I limited it to the personal responsibilities of hosts and guests, but it allowed me then to tell more stories. So I infused sort of my points, my sermonizing, with actual excerpts from Russian fairy tales, and um, it was hard for me to tell how it landed because there was so much going on. But I had more people than I thought I would, and it seemed to be well received. So who knows? Not for me to say.
Right. Man, sounds like I missed out on a good talk.
It was fun.
Now, you had mentioned Russian fairy tales, and
Yeah.
that's really a big reason why I invited you to a discussion today, is because you have a three-volume set coming out on Kickstarter. And I want to, in a little bit, share my screen, and you can just describe what's happening and some of the exciting publications there.
Great.
But as a way of introducing it, I'm really curious, how does one get into writing or translating, telling Russian fairy tales? Does one just wake up one day and say, "Gosh, that'd be a great thing to get into. Why not?" How did it
Well,
go for you?
you said three things there: writing, translating, and telling, and they're not the same, right? Each one of those is an entirely different experience. So I started out, okay, well, how does one do this? In my case, it's simply a part of my DNA. So I come from Russian stock. I was born in the U.S., but I spoke Russian before I spoke English, and we lived in a little Russian ghetto in San Francisco, in an area of the city that was fairly residential, but that only meant that you could speak Chinese or Russian on the streets, and you'd get by fine. Like, you could
Mm.
actually not learn English, and you could, either one of those languages is fine. And if you have both, it's even better because that expands your opportunities. But you really didn't need English at all. It's not like that anymore. Actually, it's kind of sad that these little micro, the word is rayon in Russian. I can't think of it in English, but kind of micro neighborhoods
Mhm.
that cities like San Francisco used to have. They're basically all gone. But when I
Mm.
was growing up, it meant that you'd have, like, the local Chinese drugstore was next to the local Russian Jewish drugstore, was next to the local Chinese restaurant, was next to the local Russian restaurant, uh, whose owners you would see in church every Saturday night and Sunday. And so it meant that there was a lot of people there with a lot of shared, as they say nowadays, shared values.
Mm.
Um, Practically speaking, that meant that you could get away with, as my parents wanted to, teaching their kids, me and my sister, Russian as the first language, because obviously English is going to come. You're surrounded by it all the time, and if you
Mhm.
want to stay bilingual your whole life, it's probably better to start with the other language, which is what they did. And they did it largely not, but largely by speaking at home, but also by infusing the culture of the home with traditional Russian culture, which included Russian music, Russian literature, and Russian fairy tales. And I just have very vivid, like, very visceral child memories of particular illustrations, particular books of fairy tales that my mom would read out of, or my grandmother would read out of. And these
Mm.
were infused and kind of mixed in together with stories from Russian history, many of which are almost semi-legendary because Russian history goes back to, the 900s. So not like American history. So you don't have the same kind of historical record like you do in the US. So there's a lot more legend, a lot more of that kind of universal history that Richard Rowland likes to talk about. It's kind of just part of the DNA of what it means to study about the past, about your past as a Russian. So these stories were just, they were in me, and I ended up studying Russian literature in Berkeley, where I got my undergrad, and it's just always there. And when I started writing my fantasy novels, which is about 10 years ago now, they were inspired by Russian fairy tales, the motifs, the ideas. It's like a meeting of Russian fairy tales and Tolkien, kind of in terms of genre.
Mm.
And I didn't even realize it, but recently I reread my series as part of a book club on my Patreon community,
Mhm.
and I was reading my first book, and it just astounded me as somebody who came back to the stories later as more of a student as opposed to somebody who just reads them for pleasure. How much those fairy tale tropes, the laws of the fairy tale universe, the characters that come, they're just all over the place in my novels, and
Mm.
sometimes I seeded them in purposely, but there's things there, like things that happen, events, characters, tropes that I wasn't even thinking about rationally. I was just writing it, and I thought, oh, that's a good idea. Well, the
Mm.
reason it's a good idea is because it's from Russian fairy tales. So
Mhm.
it was really strange. So initially for me, it was writing in that mode, but for a more specific genre, which was epic fantasy in the Tolkienian style, because that's what I like to read. And then later on, I started to get the itch to retell the stories themselves, but not in Russian, because there's plenty of good Russian storytellers, and the audience around me for the most part is not Russian speaking. So why not try it in English? And that's where the translation started to come in. I had a
Mm.
podcast for Ancient Faith for a while called In a Certain Kingdom, and Natalie Wilson, who's a composer, and I created kind of a musical storytelling experience where I would tell the stories and she would accompany them with her own original piano music, and that led to what's going on now, which is I actually encountered, and I'm sorry this is a long answer, but you asked three questions, so
I love it. Keep going.
yeah. But I encountered Martin Shaw through Paul Kingsnorth a few years back, and somehow it became possible for me to reach out to him directly,
Mm.
and I had him on my Patreon channel last year, and he wasn't Orthodox yet. He was still discerning, kind of searching. So to see him, and I signed up for a Substack, I was kind of watching him make this rather tumultuous journey, and it was really interesting to talk to him in the midst of this, both as a storyteller and as a growing Christian. And he inspired me with his style and with his love and with his very natural and visceral way of inhabiting the stories in a
Mm.
way that would have been more typical for someone in the old world, where the stories are not simply literate. They're not at all written down artifacts, but they're living. They're living. He calls them beings, and he's quite literal about it.
Mm.
It's But whatever they are passed on from oral storyteller to oral storyteller, which is the way they're supposed to be done. So when I talked to him, I kind of got a fire in there somewhere to kind of explore the stories anew for the sake of the stories themselves, not simply as fodder for my fantasy novels, which is what it was before, not simply as research to get more ideas for other stories that I might write, but just kind of to focus a little bit more on the fairy tales themselves and kind of go deep into them. And that's been a hard thing, because to do that, it requires you to kind of have a completely different attitude towards creativity. It's not
Mm.
about words per day, pages per month, books published per year. It's about slowly going deep into the story, reading them, reading their different versions, trying out telling them to your children, trying out telling them to my patrons on the internet, writing them down, uh, speaking them on stage in front of people, seeing how they react. It's a totally different experience of creativity, and it made me realize that the stories themselves are worthy of being celebrated in a way that with the kind of attention and love that I had been giving to my other work, but I hadn't been giving to these stories.
Mm.
So that's what this Kickstarter is about. It's an attempt to show them in a format that's very accessible, which is the printed word. Um,
Mm.
but what I'm trying to infuse into kind of the spirit of the thing, is this underlying deep love for the substrate of the story itself, for the history of the people, for the symbolism of the stories themselves, and for the long tradition of storytellers telling these stories over centuries and maybe even millennia. So yeah, that's, as you see, that's why there's so much folk art and a lot of
Mm.
emphasis on visual stuff, because this is very much a celebration of a kind of art that is not simply written, it's not simply spoken, it's not simply drawn, it's all of those things. It's kind of its own ecosystem, and it is a reflection in a lot of ways of the Russian people, and um it, it's a true artifact of their culture that they've left behind them in ways that are even some ways even more powerful than the great Russian literature of the 19th century. Even though I'm a big Dostoevsky fan, I would never compare. But you know what I mean. Like this is a if elite culture has ways of preserving its best proponents, like Dostoevsky, like Tolstoy, like all the great writers of the past, because they write and they publish, and these books become physical artifacts that you can pass on and republish. The
Mhm.
stories aren't that, right? They have to be either put together in books and published, or constantly retold. But the oral tradition of storytelling has died in Russia. There hasn't been an oral storyteller who's actually had the tradition passed on to them since the 1970s. That was 1970 something, was the last living Russian storyteller. Um,
Last living.
so
So it's almost like a rejuvenation project or reviving.
Well, I wouldn't dare say that I'm somehow reviving the ancient practice, because I'm not somebody who's received it, right? But
Mm.
the what has been left is something that perhaps what we're doing is we're taking um, the seeds of what was in the past and planting them, so that perhaps a new tradition can start coming about. And of course, I'm doing it in translation for an English speaking audience, so I don't even know what that means in terms of the regeneration of culture. But I think these stories are beautiful. I think that they do a lot of work to help us orient ourselves properly in our lives, and they give us very interesting, um, empathetic connections to the way that the world works, in ways that Jonathan talks about all the time. Um,
Mhm.
Kind of templates, if you want, although that's kind of a technical term. But they seed in us a kind of instinctual and a deep, profound understanding of how the world is and how we must act within it,
Mhm.
to be better human beings, better people.
It's
So that
interesting
was,
how
yeah.
you mentioned that you were rereading your first book. I mean, how many books have you published now?
Um, I think it's 11.
11.
Yeah,
Nicholas. That's awesome. So
it's pretty cool.
the one that I was first introduced to was the last Kickstarter you did.
Yes, I love
Yeah.
that book.
And it's just a beauty, man. Like talk about inspiration. Um, and this was great because of course, what else do you do at the Symbolic World Summit but stack your suitcase full of
Yes,
books that you could bring so people could leave notes in them.
that's awesome.
Um, and so you're going back to your first one and seeing just how deeply embedded or integrated those stories were in your life. And
Hmm.
without even consciously like, I'm going to sit down and come up with this strategy for applying
Yeah,
the Russian fairy tales with this epic
that's right.
fantasies.
Yeah,
It's like someone sitting down and being like, oh, here's the hero's journey, point A, point 1A, point
yep,
B. Just
yep.
going to finish this cycle for the hero's journey. It's like it's just interesting. It makes me think of, well, another follow-up question would be, what have you seen as the effect of these fairy tale stories been upon, adults on one hand and then children on the other?
Yeah, it's a good question. Because like I hinted at before, the stories themselves, I've always tended to look at them as in the way that you described, like kind of the things that you go into a little room and mark it out, how you're going to put this thing here, and cool element of story placed into inciting incident here. And there was a little bit of that, but um, when I ended up actually going deeper into the stories and telling them first on the podcast, and later on in actual live events, I was astounded at how visceral the reactions were, primarily from parents. And of course, that's going to be the case because the parents are the ones who are able to leave the kinds of artifacts on the internet that you can read, as in reviews and emails and um, uh, that kind of thing. So from parents, it's been the feedback has been incredible. It's been always, why aren't you doing more? Give me more, give me more. I've actually had some encounters with children who love the stories, and those are wonderful because it's really fascinating how the love of the story kind of brings the adult down from the world of ideas and the too much abstraction that we live in now, and kind of brings them down to a more natural level. I wouldn't say like a juvenile level, just a more human level. While the love of story actually raises the children from the level of the immature and juvenile to something that is very profound and very wise, because these stories are kind of distillations of many centuries of people telling them over and over again. So there's something quite valuable in the thing that's left, the form of it that was actually put into printed word. There's something about it that's quite special. And I'm not the only one to make that point. There's a lot of scholars of fairy tales who would make that point. But then to see that kind of sparking joy in the eyes of the children, you being able to share it at a very heart to heart level, you realize that there's something about the stories themselves that even transcends the desire of the author to find his book, 50 years down the road in the local Barnes and Noble, which is of course what every author wants. It's that that just enough level of fame that you won't be forgotten after you've published the book. But this is
Mm.
something else. It's something deeper, and it's really been interesting for me to see the response. And I've heard from people who and this is primarily from people who they might have read both of my stuff, both the fantasy fiction and the fairy tales, but they'll point oftentimes to the fairy tales to say, your stories helped me get through COVID, or
Mm.
your stories opened up a world for me that I didn't know existed, and now I'm going to church again. Or you know these stories you tell, I didn't realize I had this yearning inside me for something greater than myself. And last week I went to an Orthodox church for the first time.
Mm.
That sort of thing. And you hear it a lot, and it's a big responsibility, and it's a little scary, but
Mhm.
ultimately, if it's about the love of story, that's humbling in itself, because these things are so old. So to be
Mm.
able to tell them in any with any sort of truth, you have to approach them humbly without thinking that you can own them.
Yes. When I came home from the summit, and this is one of the books that I came home with, which is just like an early printing of
Yeah,
what may come into this 3 volume set.
yeah,
Um, so I sat down during story time with my kids, having just listened to several stories from Martin Shaw, inspired. It's like, gotta pass this on to my kids. Like I came home with a flame, gotta pass it on. And so
yes, yes, yes,
this was one of the best books I brought because it allowed me to get right into it.
yeah.
I felt like it's some untrained muscles. And so I
Mm.
felt like this was good because it was like I didn't have to like fabricate a story,
Yeah,
just out of my
which could be
imagination.
scary. Yeah,
Um, but it allowed me to have like a framework that I could share with them right away with a certain level of ease that, well, I know I'm going to be doing something meaningful and it's going to
yeah,
be a
because
good
you're
story.
working in a tradition. You know that these books, these stories have been passed through the filter of many centuries, so
Right.
they're going to be the form of them as they're presented is already a good thing.
And I was surprised. I was surprised. It was my first Russian fairy tale experience. It was interesting, of course, me, my analytical mind saying like, oh, these patterns are really interesting. Like it's like
Yeah.
almost like these triplets of story of
Yes.
like,
Yes.
something happens the same time, but slightly different each time. I
Yeah.
thought was interesting. And
Yeah.
then
3 is a very important number. Yeah, for sure.
yes, and it was almost I found that it was helping me substantiate the story. Like I could almost, after I was done reading it, tell it the next day
Well,
because it was like,
that's what those rhythms are for. So they do two things, right? The first thing is that they reflect the patterns of reality, as Jonathan would say. So the repetition of the number 3 is very much a reflection of the fact that the Trinitarian reality is reflected throughout all of nature, throughout all of created nature. Something, by the way, that Dorothy Sayers brings out beautifully in a book called The Mind of the Maker,
mm,
which, if you've never read, highly recommended.
mm,
Um, but so it's, on the one hand, it's this deep expression of reality on a very folk level, but it's also has the secondary utility of making it easier to remember, because repeated patterns stick in the mind, and human
mhm.
beings naturally gravitate towards repetitions of 3. So it's something like it just kind of clicks into the brain. So yeah, I'm
Yes, I
glad you
totally
experienced
felt
that.
that. Like I could recognize it happening cognitively, like in the
That's
moment even.
awesome.
The other thing that I found interesting is I think it was like the second or third story in, it gets pretty violent and graphic. And here
Yes.
I'm reading it to my 6 and my 3-year-old. We
Yes.
also have a 5-month-old baby now.
Yeah.
Um, and so I was a little bit trepidatious. I was like, as I was reading it, you kind of read ahead just a little bit before you read it out loud. And you're like, okay, there's like heads on stakes. There's like this Baba Yaga, and she's kind of creepy.
And
And
she's gonna eat you if you do the wrong thing,
yes, yeah, I was like, no pressure. And
Yeah.
so my like during the telling, my 6-year-old, my 3-year-old was kind of like here, there, and everywhere. He hasn't really
Yeah.
locked in imaginatively.
Well, yeah, 3 years old. Come on.
Yeah. So and then but 6-year-old, she was like, I was kind of gauging her response,
Mhm.
and the way that she was during the telling was very somber, still, quiet attention was there. And I was like,
Mhm.
okay, is this because she's really into it
Yeah.
and fascinated, or is she terrified? I don't know, but
Yeah.
I'm gonna keep reading. So I get to the end, and the ending, what was it? Like the horse kicks the head of the bad guy. End of story. And there was just this long moment of quiet, and I was just kind of wasn't gonna say anything, was gonna wait for her response. And she says, that was awesome. The horse kicked the head. It's just and I was just thinking, I was like, okay, there's it surprised me. It was totally a surprise how
Yeah.
she responded, but I don't know that I would want her to watch that
No.
necessarily.
No.
But for some reason, when I was reading it, it seemed really appropriate and it
Well,
engaged her
you're
in all
very
the right
brave.
ways.
You're very brave. All right. And I have to commend you that on the first reading you didn't filter it, that you just let it happen. Because I'll for myself, and I'm somebody who grew up on these stories. I want to filter them to my kids. But it's so if you're somebody who wants a bit more of support on the analytical sort of research brain side about this stuff, then I always recommend Vegan Groyan's book. I keep forgetting the title, which is terrible, and but it's also a reflection of how the titles are important, and you have to make sure you pick the right ones. It's something about cultivating the
That's
moral
a good point.
imagination.
What's the name?
Something about cultivating the moral imagination. I don't remember the title.
Author's name?
Guroyan.
Okay.
He's an Armenian theologian, and he wrote a book about fairy tales about 10, 20 years ago. And he recently reissued it. It's an Oxford University Press book, but it's a popular book. It's
Mm,
not a scholarly book. And he makes an impassioned plea to parents to raise their children on canonical fairy tales. And for him, canonical is Hans Christian Andersen, the Grimm brothers, um, and that sort of thing. So
mhm.
he puts a lot of emphasis on the written um, codification of the oral tradition, which is something that Martin Shaw probably would start spitting at,
No.
uh, because it's basically making dead the thing that is alive in the
Right.
transmission, right?
Mhm.
But we don't all have the luxury of being bards who get to live out in the wilds of the Devonshire countryside in tents whenever we feel like it.
Yeah,
So
true enough.
in our limited ability to be able to come into contact with oral tradition, sometimes we need the written artifact. So he says, Vegan Gorian says that he makes the point that the violence in the stories is absolutely necessary. First off,
Mm,
because the children don't have the same uh, touch points as we do, as we adults do. They don't feel it in the same way because they haven't gone through adulthood, so they don't feel the viscerality of the violence the way that we do. For
mm,
them, the violence is a kind of it's a very realistic and very vivid expression of extremes, whether it's good or evil, right? And for them, they don't want the subtle stuff, right? They just like there's nothing in fairy tales to settle. It's all externalities, like internal states that are out in the open,
mm, mm.
because that's a reflection of how they live. That's a reflection of their state of mind and state of being. They're still in a kind of dream state where everything is extreme, right? This is why they constantly react with temper tantrums at the smallest provocation. It's why they're capable of such intense joy and such incredible affection, because there's no nuance. It's everything all the time. It's also one of the reasons why they have to grow out of it, because if they're unable to transmute that into something that becomes a strong internal state, it becomes pathological, right? Childhood
Mm,
that's extended too long is dangerous.
mm.
But in terms of telling stories to them, they take the violence very calmly. It's totally okay
They
for them.
do. They really
Yeah,
do.
it's really interesting.
Yeah. It came at a great time because we had just finished the 7 books of the Narnia series.
Mhm.
And I kind of had this like grief at the end of it. I was like, I wish
Yeah,
we could just keep, I wish there was an eighth, ninth, and 10th book.
yeah,
And so it was just perfect timing. Perfect timing.
yeah. Well, this is why we write, is because we all had that experience at the end of Lord of the Rings and Narnia, and we looked around and there was hardly anything like it. So this is why we go and try to become good writers, so we can maybe create something similar.
Yeah, exactly. And let's see. So why don't we just describe in detail, a little bit more detail, what's happening with the books that you're coming out with. I'll go and share screen one more time.
Sure. So the Kickstarter, honestly, I had very little expectations. One of these stories, I translated them a while back, so this isn't like brand new material. But in my podcast, I had a backlog of about 10 stories that had never actually been put into a bound book. So these past few years, for a variety of reasons, I think a lot of people are feeling this. There's been a kind of intensity of life that has caused people to go into kind of busyness overdrive as a compensation mechanism. I think a lot of people have felt this, like the ability to be present in the given reality for a lot of people is something they avoid. It's partially because of COVID. It's partially because of the wars that are happening everywhere. It's partially because people, I think, are recognizing the fact that in some level we're living in the long extended ruins of Western civilization, and a lot of people aren't dealing well with this, especially with all the manufactured distractions that you have at your fingertips whenever you have a smartphone, which I heard Eric Weinstein describe it. It's not a phone, it's an experience. Like it's simulated reality, so much so that the VR things that are coming out now with Apple and other things like this they're not that much of a jump from what you already have. It's just more immersive, right? The thing has already happened. And the fact that everybody's freaking out about the goggles is like, guys, you're already there. This is just making it a little bit more high def. But for me, that this kind of I've also had this difficulty in dealing with just reality. And me being a Russian, and kind of I've had a lot of trouble dealing with the war and its implications. And there's some family connections over in the old country that, all this, it's all kind of messy, right? So I've had a
The
very
Ukraine
hard
War,
time.
you mean?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So it's been very difficult for me to kind of sit down and produce anything long form at all. Like since The Son of the Deathless, which I wrote 2 years ago, I really haven't written anything.
Mm.
So I'm looking at the stuff that I have. And I'm like, okay, well, I have this book that I could publish. It's about 10 stories. It would naturally continue the series of Russian fairy tales, but they're not selling very well. So I'm like, do I do this or not? Then I went on Matt Fradd's podcast, Pints with Aquinas, last year.
Yes. Great podcast.
It was
Enjoyed that a
wonderful.
lot.
It was a wonderful experience. Matt's a fantastic interviewer, and he's just very, very welcoming. And it was just a lovely experience. But that podcast sold a ton of books for me.
Mm.
Just insane. And they were all the
You-
fairy tale books.
Yeah, you
So I'm like,
captured Matt
okay,
Fradd's attention. You,
yeah,
you really did. I think he just
yeah.
couldn't speak more highly of the book.
Well, I was very grateful. It was a really nice opportunity to talk, to just be with not just him, but there's an extended group of people there that I encountered in that, traditional Catholic um, hotbed that is Steubenville, Ohio. A very interesting place.
Oh, I've heard
Um,
stories.
yeah, plenty. But so the book started selling. Like, well, maybe I can kind of add to that experience to people because they seem to be liking it. So the point of the Kickstarter was to put into concrete form this experience that I talked about going more deeply into the stories, which is all an experience that's largely inside me, but it's not being transmitted to anyone because I've stopped doing the fairy tale podcast for a variety of reasons. So I thought, well, why don't I put this out, see if there's any interest, and if we can get enough attention and interest to it, then maybe I can use it as a kind of because my writing is my work, as in it financially supports me. Maybe I can use this as a not an excuse, but as an opportunity to do some things that need to be done for the infrastructure of the business. Not to get all all mundane on you, but it means like fixing up the covers, making sure that they're quality, because they weren't very good. I basically photoshopped
Mm,
by
mm,
myself. Um, Working on the stories themselves, making sure that the editing is top notch, making sure that the stories are in the form that I want them to be, and not simply the form that I managed to put them in quickly as a result of lack of time before. And then I've been long thinking and kind of stewing in the meaning of the stories, what they mean to me and what they might mean to others, and how that might be useful to them. It's 2024. Things are about to get insane. I mean,
mm,
it is an
mm,
election year, and there's stuff is happening. So people need not just consolation, but they also need
mhm,
a weather vane. They need something to direct them in, to start walking in the right along the right path. And stories do that really well because
mhm,
they don't preach at you; they just show you the way the world actually is.
mm,
So I wanted to draw that out a little bit, and I've been learning from Martin both in person and by reading his stuff and listening to him speak, Martin Shaw, and he does that very well. He's able to draw out the importance and the meaning of the stories without killing the stories by dissecting them into pieces, which is always the
mm.
trouble, right? Because if you start analyzing the stories and start saying, well, this means that, and that means, and this character
Oh,
is actually this, which is basically the entirety of modern fairy tale and folkloric and
yeah.
folklore studies,
Analysis, point for point analysis.
which
Yeah.
just kills the thing, right? It's no longer a living being, right? Or it's no longer a living experience. So I want to avoid that as much as possible. But he does that really beautifully. In spite of the fact that he's a PhD in the thing, he's a PhD
Yeah.
in folklore studies, so he's able to do both. And watching him and kind of seeing how it might be done, I'm carefully tending in that direction. I'm going to start putting some of those things into this new edition, which is
Mhm.
a Kickstarter exclusive edition in all
Yeah.
3 volumes. So there's 10 stories in each of the volumes. Volume 1 is kind of the greatest hits of Russian fairy tales. Volume 2 is my attempt to take some of the best stories in the Russian epic poetry genre, which is a slightly different genre.
Mm,
And they're not poetry; they're prose renderings of what in the Russian is a very specific poetic form, which I haven't
mm,
mastered, and I'm not even going to try yet. Eventually, I might try it in English, but it's difficult. It's very particular, and
mm.
really, it should be sung, not spoken.
Oh,
Um, yeah,
mm.
to a special kind of harp called the gusля. And then
So,
the third one is kind of branching out into the slightly weirder and less well known stories, including the some of the stories in the cycle of the Ivan the fool or Ivan the idiot, which is it's a very famous cycle in Russian fairy tales where the most unexpected and most unlikely person ends up winning everything at the expense of all the wise and all of the prosperous and all of the good of the world. And
what a
those stories,
perfect 2024 story.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. So
Wow.
that's kind of the reason why I put it out. It immediately seemed to get to resonate with people. It's going very strong.
Mm.
As you've shown the screenshots, it's getting plenty of
Yeah.
money. So
Yeah.
that's allowing me to do things like attract artists, like make sure that I get audiobooks of this out so that it's not just in podcast form, but in actual audio
Mm,
form.
mhm,
Making sure that we fix up some of the technical things that were wrong on the audio side in the podcasts. So it's a lot of like little tweaks here and there,
mhm,
but that's important to me because as a publisher as well as a writer, I feel very strongly about the need to really move into a model where I publish things that are beautiful. Not
mhm,
simply the content is good, but the presentation of the content is beautiful in and of
mhm.
itself. I think
Yeah.
that's very important. And as AI is going insane and it's getting more and more advanced, and basically we're going to get to a point where there's going to be an entire subset of the population that is completely okay with AI written stories
Yep.
because they're not looking for originality. They're just looking for an experience that's easily repeated. When with that happening, what's important for us who believe in the transmission of true culture is to really focus not just on how we do a thing, like as in the stories themselves, but also in the presentation of the stories. It's no small thing.
Mm,
And that's expensive, right? To be able to make beautiful things, you have to have money. Um, in the Middle Ages, all artists had rich patrons. That's just a reality.
right.
And and more recently, the publishing houses were in effect a kind of rich patron. because they would advance you um, a bunch of money from their coffers with the
Right.
hope that you would then make it up for them so they could make the thing beautiful. But mass producing paperbacks, mass market paperbacks, um, cheap paper, et cetera, et cetera. Even the publishing houses now are cutting down on all these costs. So you no longer really have beautiful objects unless you're
Mhm.
specifically setting aside money, and a lot of money in some cases, to create a beautiful thing. So I'm trying to move
Yeah.
more and more into that because people really want it. And I mean, you showed the your copy of the Son of the Deathless. That's very
Oh,
much
yeah,
an attempt
totally.
to
Mhm.
go into that. I mean, this is like
Just look at
as
that,
close
man.
to handcrafted as you can get in
Yeah.
this particular um in this world of ours. So I mean, I
Yeah.
suppose I could learn how to bind books and all that stuff, but
Hmm.
until
Or
I
you could
can.
work with Colin. We had the
Yeah,
bookbinder at the
exactly,
summit.
exactly, yeah, exactly. So
Um, Gosh, I would wonder what that would look like. Do you get a chance to meet Colin at the summit in person?
no, I just saw his work in your hands.
Oh,
So
yeah, yeah. So whenever Son of the Deathless came out and I got my copy, I was excited enough to actually publish that response video, which is
yeah, that was great. That was
yeah,
lovely.
yeah, it's more just kind of a tongue-in-cheek kind of fun thing. But
It was fun. It was
no,
fun.
it I'm glad I did though because it captured a really like historic moment in my development where
Mm,
before I was considered books more of like a source of containing content, right?
yes, yes,
But then when I experienced that, of course, the Kickstarter was a great experience unto its own, but then like
yeah,
receiving this, holding it up, and it has like, it's not just a hardcover with like a Photoshop image. It's like you can tell it's like, no, this was like handcrafted,
yeah.
or darn close to it. And
Yeah,
then
as close as you can get. Yeah, with the
and
digital
then
printer.
just to how it has different layers, it has the gold on it. It has I realized it was a work of beauty or a work of
Hmm.
art. And it wasn't just, but even before I opened the cover and read the contents, I was already impacted at a deep level. Like it was already drawing me towards beauty.
But that's what we want, right? I mean, this is the experience that we all crave as readers, as consumers. Terrible word, right? But we don't get very often because everybody's rushing towards something all the
Mm.
time. And to be
Yeah.
able to actually stop and give the necessary attention and time to actually create something like this takes a lot of energy, takes a lot of attention.
Well, especially like with Son of the Deathless, because you're working with two other artists too,
Right.
So it's like
That's right.
working with Vesper and with Heather as
Heather
well.
Paulington, yeah, she
And
did
so
the
then you're
cover.
you're
Yeah.
adding that added complexity of communication and everybody working on one project. It's not
Yeah,
like
and
one
it's a
person that can
common
just crank it
work.
out.
Yeah, no, it is a common work. It's not simply a matter of communicating or like hiring out something so they can just do it and send it to you.
Hmm.
No, it's a work of common culture. Or at least it turned out to be that way. I'm not sure that it's always that way for everybody, but I was very blessed that those two lovely women were so willing to take part in the experience, and it was quite lovely. The whole thing was quite lovely.
Right when you came out with Son of the Deathless, that's when Colin Miller started making his skills more available or more known to the other
Ah,
Symbolic World artists. And so that's when he came out with, oh, all right. It's show and tell time. Okay,
I love
hour in
it.
a podcast. We're getting down into it. So he
Oh
came out
wow.
with the Cosmic Chiasmus, which is
Mhm.
Cormac Jones' article that he originally published on the Symbolic World blog.
Yeah,
And then I mean, Colin and I go into more detail but basically Colin saw an opportunity to display the meaning of chiasmus within a book binding because if you fold pages, that's kind of the natural
it's
thing.
chiastic. It's a
It's
chiastic
it
structure in and of
totally.
itself. Yeah.
And so he was inspired by that. They came out with that book. And then the other article that I had published on the symbolic world, kind of drawing out the themes of Exodus and other things for the sci-fi movie Arrival.
Love that movie.
Then
Love
he,
it.
we started talking. He got inspired by the idea. Which side do I have it on? Right here. Yeah.
There it is. Yeah.
So then this one, he saw the film and he's like, "Oh yeah, the outline of the meeting place of these higher beings and
Yep.
earthlings. I could turn that into a book." So then he added glass and then this like opaque layer, which is kind of cool because you can kind of create that clouded effect.
Yeah.
And
It's
so
really
then all
cool.
of a sudden it's like, "Oh my gosh, this thing that was this virtual, expression of ideas or helping people understand these, ancient themes, symbolism, and then connect it to newer stories.
Yeah.
All of a sudden, it was this physical thing, and so it's just been a really renaissance for me, not just as a consumer, but also as an artist as well.
Yeah.
Looking at written word as the potential to partake in almost like an artful beauty as well.
Totally. Totally. Yeah. And but that's hard because it requires you to have the necessary to do the necessary interior work to not constantly dissipate yourself in all directions, which the internet encourages. So you need to use the internet as the means by which you spread these
Mm.
things, by even sometimes by which you make these things. But everything about the internet is calculated to destroy that attention that's necessary to stop long enough to be able to actually create the thing, or even the time needed to gather the internal structures for that thing to then be birthed inside you before it even comes out into concrete form, which
Right.
is really, it's a problem.
Something that you mentioned in our roundtable talk that we published early on the channel was
Yeah.
that, you can be an artist and you can, tell stories or you can create them, but it's almost like just by necessity of where we're at in the culture, you have to do a little bit of the explanation work.
Yeah.
So that way people can at least have a grid for being able to appreciate it. Right. So you maybe
Yeah.
don't go, two ditches, like don't go full analysis and break
Yeah.
down every little component. But
But
then,
just give a taster to get
yeah,
people
find that middle
interested.
ground where you can at least help
It's
them
hard. It's hard to do, but
appreciate the vintage of what you're doing.
exactly. How can you appreciate a fine vintage unless you've been trained to recognize the notes in the wine, right?
Yeah.
You need to have a session with a sommelier before you can understand that this wine is actually worth the price,
Yes, totally. But also, to tie back to what you said earlier about hospitality,
Hmm.
I approach maybe one way of approaching what you're doing with Kickstarter and publishing these, works of beauty in text as a host and a guest.
Yes. Yes.
Because when you said consumer, it's like, well, part of me, there was like oh, that's a nasty word, right?
Yeah.
And then the other part of me was like, I like being a consumer of good things, you know?
Yes.
And so that seems like what you're doing is like being a good host of being able to present these meaningful things, these beautiful things in a way where people can appreciate it and, invest the value into it.
I mean, that's beautiful what you said because a good host will never put too much food on the table, but will choose the dishes carefully. So
Mm,
that's just yet, I mean, you've just given me even more of a internal reason to continue the things that I've been doing, which is slowing down and focusing more on individual things and instead of trying to do too much at any given time. So I
yeah,
appreciate
and what a
that.
countercultural thing of you to say.
It really is. It really is.
Yeah, especially because, like Amazon printing, I know I can see a place for it,
Yeah.
but God, I hope it's not the only thing people do,
No.
So, thank God for Kickstarter and the ability to give people the opportunity to sit at the table and enjoy something that's
Yeah.
nourishing.
Yeah, and also be involved in the creation of the thing. That's one of the nice things about Kickstarter is that it does promote. It has its own kind of internal social aspect to it. So you really feel like you're part of an event, not simply somebody who consumes, right? Just
Hmm.
buy, receive. No, you're involved. The creator can speak to you through frequent email interactions, and you have input. You can help guide the direction of the project should the creator want that sort of input. So it's
Hmm.
yeah, I find it very rewarding.
Hmm. Speaking of which, I have to say your newsletter is one of my favorites.
Oh, thank you. That's very
You
kind.
publish what about at least twice, maybe 2 to 4 times a month?
I
Is that
try to
right?
do it once every 2 weeks. Yeah.
Yeah. But I mean, like, well, let's see. Maybe I'll go ahead and pull it up. Yeah, I feel like I get a little bit of everything. And so I get the updates, but I also get the ability to, let me see if I can switch here. Yes, there we go. So I get the ability to, get tidbits and stories, a little bit of writing advice, a little bit of behind the scenes, and then like the reader's nook, man, don't stop this. I've just been loving this. I click on at least one or two of these every time.
Yeah.
Like the why fairy tales are like dreams of Eden. It's like, oh my gosh, I would never have found that.
Yeah. Things appear. If you're paying attention, things start to
Mm.
bubble up, even in the internet. So
And
it's
then
it's my it's my pleasure to to find those things and share them with readers. It really is.
The other thing I noticed, you say cow country from upstate New York, but earlier in the talk you mentioned that you're from the Bay Area.
Yeah, yeah. San Franciscan,
So you
born and
grew up
raised.
so you grew up on the West Coast, and then at what point did you go over to the New York, the East Coast?
Yeah, this is about 11, 10, 11 years ago now.
Oh,
Uh,
okay. So you grew
yeah.
up into your adulthood on the
Yep.
West Coast. What?
Yep. Yep.
Okay. So let's see. San Francisco. So I lived in like North Bay, so like Santa Rosa and
Yep.
Petaluma, a little bit into Marin in my early
Hmm.
adult years when I was going to, community college, just
Yeah.
getting started as an adult. Then I grew up in Clear Lake, California. And
That's awesome. Love Clear
yeah,
Lake.
so
I mean, Santa Rosa, like the Santa Rosa Mountains, is just there. I used to go up there, just hike and sit in the grass and the yellow grass and pull out a notebook and start writing just because it's so beautiful. 'Cause there's some really nice parks and things over there that you can go. But then I stopped because um I noticed that I was covered in ticks after one of those
oh,
experiences. So
yep.
I started to look for benches, and sitting at the benches was you get just the same amount of beauty without the ticks. So
If it's not the ticks, it's the poison oak that will get you.
I know, right? Oh my goodness.
Oh man. Yeah. Oh my gosh, like that opens up a whole nother door. So Northern California. So like what are some other places that you've been in Northern California?
Well, I mean that of course Tahoe, you're going to go there every winter and
Oh
spend
yeah.
whatever time
Mhm.
you can in the snow because you're not going to get any of the snow in San Francisco. You're not going to get any weather in San Francisco other than just fog. So coming up to Santa Rosa every once in a while was really nice because the change in temperature is significant.
Mhm.
And I had some friends in Santa Rosa. There's a nice Roquefort parish up there that we used to go visit. And in my
Oh,
last few years
yes.
before I moved, I conducted a men's choir that was Bay Area based, and one of the founders of that choir was local to that parish. So they
Hmm.
would have us come and sing services for them every once in a while, which was really nice. A small kind of country parish, not a lot of people. So you'd go in there. The acoustics are garbage, but you got this group of like 10, 15 young or old, actually, it didn't matter, men kind of singing really great Russian Orthodox Church music. It was
Awesome.
really great, really fun. You know
So we're
what's so
making
great about the thing that I really miss, other than the nature, because I love the Golden Hills, which is something you don't see
oh,
anywhere else.
yeah.
And it's the weirdest thing when you have rain and suddenly you're in Ireland. You're like, this isn't California. Like, bring back the dryness. Everybody's always complaining
Yes.
about the wildfires. Like, guys, this is what makes it special.
I
It's what
know.
makes
It's
it so
like our very
unique.
beauty is also our demise too.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's something very right about that, and the fact that it's
Yes.
gone too far in a certain direction is just an indication that we're not using what God gave us wisely. Because
Mm,
you know,
yes.
as a Californian, that the wildfires are necessary for
Oh
for the
yeah.
ecosystem.
Hmm.
But
Spent my whole last, I don't know, 2 months doing burn piles, just making sure that the
yeah,
woods are
yeah,
beautiful and they're not
yeah,
dangerous, you know.
absolutely. Because it can get right now. It's insane what's
Yeah.
going on over there.
Right now I was spending some time over in Denver,
Hmm.
actually meeting up with 5Z, the DJ with Dirt Poor Robins. That
Oh
was in the
yeah,
back,
cool.
like doing all the backing tracks. Yeah,
Oh yeah.
that's a fascinating guy. Maybe I'll bring him on at one point.
Uh,
Um, and then my friend Evan Dukas, who was a gardener, I've had him on the channel as well. And some of his other friends who are kind of like, I call them Colorado mountain hippies,
yeah,
which are, they're my people. I love them.
yeah.
So I was flying home from that, going over to Sacramento Airport, and the hills right now are just lime green. Like
Really,
there's so much green. It's just
that's so weird.
beautiful. But then,
So
like you
weird.
said, at some point in, May or June, the sun gets hotter and hotter and the grass turns into this, it's almost like a golden sea.
It
Like when
is.
the breeze comes in, it looks like waves just like shining against the grass.
It,
It's,
it's incredible. There's
yes.
nothing like it. It's such a unique place. It's just, and not surprisingly, a lot of writers have come from that place,
Mm,
and
yeah.
are being in that particular aesthetic, that natural aesthetic, really does something to. I mean, Ursula Le Guin wrote a book called Always Coming Home, which is entirely set in a kind of far future version of Northern California. So even
Mm.
though she was not a Californian, no, she was, I suppose. Yeah, she lived much of her life in California, but um, it even makes it into sort of far future sci-fi for some writers. So
Oh, there you go.
yeah,
Now, what
but
about the historical Russian presence in California? Do
I
you ever
mean, that's
connect
the
with
other
that?
thing, right? That's the other thing. So all the way down to San Francisco. effectively, not quite, right? Because San Francisco was owned by the Spanish, but the southernmost point of the Russian Empire was a fort about 2 hours north of San Francisco called Fort Ross. And it's still there. The fort's still there. They not recently, I don't know when they rebuilt it, but they
Mhm.
rebuilt it as a museum piece. And it's part of my childhood growing up. We used to go there every year. There were actually two weekends, and this is part of the tragedy of Orthodoxy in America is that instead of having one culturally themed event a year, we always had two because the Russian Church abroad in my childhood was doing their best to wall themselves off from the rest of the universe because the world's going to end any second now. So who cares? And so
Oh, man.
the OCA had their own day. We had our own day, which is unfortunate. But now I think things are a little simpler. But every year we go there on Memorial Day weekend and we dress in our Russian folk costumes. We go to church. There's a special liturgy that was served in the chapel, which is just a chapel. It's not really a. I'm not even sure if it's a fully consecrated church. I don't think it is. There's no proper altar. There's no icon screen. It's just a small wooden chapel. But still, they make do. The bishop used to go there every year. They'd have a big liturgy with the bishop serving, and the rest of the day, you could go and see all the museum pieces. The buildings are made up like an actual something like Jamestown or Plymouth without the people. They should do that. They should have like people living there. That would be the coolest thing. They should
Yeah,
totally do
come on.
that. But the
Yeah.
really cool thing about it is that there were interactions between the Russians and the local Indians, which you're not supposed to say Indians, but I don't care. Miwoks and others.
Yep.
You had intermarriage, and the local Native American communities were actually really strong during that time. They kept their traditions. They then extended them into the added experience of being Russian Orthodox. Sort of like what's going on in Alaska to this day, where you have natives with who consider the Russian Church to be as much a part of their heritage as any of
Mm.
their Native American
Yes.
um, old time heritage. So that was there. And by the way, all that disappeared when the Russians left. There are no more
Mm.
Miwoks, as far as I know.
Mm.
I think they were exterminated.
Yeah.
Um,
Just remnants around here.
yeah, maybe,
Miwakoma.
yeah.
Hmm.
But that's also something that you can see there. You can see that there was a really interesting um, exchange of cultures between the Russian
Hmm.
colonizers and the locals, with
Hmm.
whom they intermarried and became
Oh yeah. Yeah.
families.
Yes.
I love that place. It's wonderful.
Oh, so my wife and I, we discovered it several years ago. Not that many years ago. You'd think maybe I went there as a child for a field trip
Yeah,
or something. It's
yeah.
about 2.5 hour drive
I
from
mean,
Clear
it's
Lake.
really remote. It's hard to get to.
It is. It really is on the edge of the world. You
Yeah.
feel that because it's not like the sandy beaches of Southern California. It's like on the
No.
cliffs, right? And these sometimes you get these alcoves. That's why they picked this location because there's an alcove with a little bit of sandy beach. But
Yeah.
but yeah, it's a very special place. It also like I'm still trying to sort out just the implications of it historically and symbolically. It's like you have
Yeah.
the Eastern world. That was the edge of the world for the Eastern world.
Yeah.
It's also the edge of the
Absolutely.
world for the Western world.
Hmm.
But you also have like Western Spain went to Mexico, went north, and then like Eastern Russia went to Alaska and came south.
Yeah.
So like directionally, there's a lot happening there too with the
Hmm.
world.
Yeah. Totally.
Yeah.
It's cross shaped, right?
Yes, that's it. It really is.
It's really sad because it didn't last very long, and
No.
the lack of funding and lack of infrastructure and
I
basically
found
just
it
lack.
that question just haunted me. I was like, why did you guys leave? And
Well,
so
because they sold Alaska. That was the
yeah,
reason. So
that
as
was a
soon as
big one.
Alaska was sold to the Americans, then that meant it's over, and you have to get out.
I read some of the historical letters and things like that,
Mhm.
and I think it was a lack of vision. They didn't
Yeah.
realize that they had the Golden State. The way
No,
that
they
they
didn't.
talked about it was not very fondly, or they didn't speak very highly of it. They're like, "Oh, the gophers are horrible, and the coast is a rough place to grow wheat."
It's very difficult to grow stuff there for sure. It's not it's
Yes.
not very arable land.
And
But if
then
you can
here you
make
just
it,
go
if you
over the
can get
hills,
down
just
past
go
the
inland,
stones,
and it's like,
yeah,
the breadbasket of the world,
that's right. That's right. No,
So
you're
had they
right. You're
known,
right.
I don't know.
But
It was a
lack of
good.
vision is, I mean, we don't want to get too historical or political here, but I mean, lack of vision is one of the reasons why Russia stopped, why it died. So,
Interesting.
yeah.
Yeah, just that leadership at key points.
Yeah. It's
Yeah.
difficult to maintain when you have such a large country and when you're trying to extend outwards, ever outwards, ever outwards. It's hard.
Right.
It's probably
You have
not
issues
natural.
at home, and then you kind of feel like gosh, that sounds like the world today. I don't know.
It does. Yeah.
Yeah, it's this ongoing tension, you
Yeah.
know. But as it turns out, I totally wore my Fort Ross shirt. So,
Yeah.
boom, there you
That was
go.
not planned, people. That
Yeah,
was not planned.
you know. Yeah, I
Eric
was
didn't even
like
know that I'm a
totally, I was like,
Californian.
yeah, I was like, I'm gonna have a conversation with this New Yorker here, and then,
Nope.
oh my goodness, yeah, what a surprise. Now, how about Clear Lake? Like, you know of Clear Lake? You've ever been
Yeah.
there?
I used to visit as a kid.
Oh,
It's a
awesome.
popular vacation spot. So
Now, on the lake, do you have certain spots that you went to?
no, I don't remember, to be honest, like, any
Ah,
specific areas. I
okay.
just remember it being very beautiful and very hot.
Oh, yeah, peak summer, it is hot. Our saving grace is that it's not that humid hot, so if you find
Yeah.
some
No,
shade,
it's definitely
fortunately we have
dry,
giant oak
which
trees, so there's plenty of
yep.
shade.
No,
Um,
I love that heat. It's lovely. It's
yes.
that heat I can have any day. This New Yorker
Yes.
heat, it's just awful. This
Uh,
100% humidity stuff is just disgusting.
yeah, there's nowhere to escape.
Nope.
You're dependent on technology, to
Yeah, and
save
we
you.
don't have AC, and it's a matter of, there's no way I'm going to put an AC in my house, which means suffering. That's okay.
So just hang out in the basement or something.
I guess, I don't know. Jump
Yeah.
in the lake and stay there.
Well, that's the other thing is, yeah, you can temper your body. Just go dip in and out of the water.
Yep.
Totally works. We
Yep.
do around here. I call myself a creek kid because we swim in the creek and you cool
That's what
yourself
you
off.
do. That's normal. Now the
Yes.
place we used to go, Clear Lake's a little far for us, but there's a
Yeah.
place a little closer over in the Vacaville area, or right before Vacaville. It's called Russian River. Uh,
Oh, yeah.
and there's a
Remnants from
spot.
that Fort Ross era.
Yep. Yeah,
Russian
totally.
River. Yeah, totally.
Yeah, no, yeah, for sure. But there's a little church that isn't open to anybody. It's under lock and key. It's a little Russian church. It used to be a camping, not a camping, like a summer camp spot with a church in
Hmm.
the center. It ended up being kind of remodeled and rebuilt and became the sort of the personal villa of a few chosen people within the hierarchy.
Okay.
But
Retreat.
yeah, yeah, yeah. But it's really beautiful there, and a lot of people had vacation homes in the surrounding villages, and that's all wine country, right? And
Mhm.
it's really beautiful, and we used to go there all the time and just kind of hang out.
Yeah, the Russian rivers, it's hard to beat. Got
It's
redwoods on
so
one
nice. The redwoods
side. Oh
everywhere.
my
Oh,
goodness. Just
so gorgeous.
yes. Um,
I think we've lost most
Goodness.
of your audience now with our Californian
Oh,
talk.
I know. Hopefully they got entranced with the story.
There you go.
Yeah, folks, if you ever want to come visit, hit me up, please.
It's
And
it's
that goes for you
beautiful.
too, because Clear Lake is a special place. In the very middle of the county is a not extinct, a not dead volcano called Volcano Canocti, to which you can
Really?
hike to the top. I
I
highly
didn't know about
suggest.
this.
Yes, and so yeah, they opened up the trails fairly recently, and you can hike to the top.
Wow.
And you get a view of everything, as far as the eye can see. You can see
Does
the
it
coast on
smoke?
Clear Lake. What was that?
Does it smoke?
No, so it's not dead, but it's not considered active either.
Okay.
But it is monitored, so
Yeah.
who knows? But oh my gosh, you'd love it. It has this mythological story that just surrounds it. There's like caverns inside, and there's
Oh, that's
reports that
awesome.
underwater cave entrances. So on low years, drought years, there's reports that people could walk inside, and then they reported seeing eyeless creatures in a lake within the cavern. And now they have like the infrared technology
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
can verify that it is in fact hollow inside and likely a lake. So
That's awesome.
yeah, I mean we have local Loch Ness monster stories.
No,
It
seriously,
has
like
all of it. It's great.
there was a group of right before I left, we had a group of writers where we would go up into the mountains in different places, Santa Rosa County, and we didn't quite go as far as Clear Lake, but we might have gotten close, where we would go like groups of 5 or 6 and take the day, do some hiking, and stop in beautiful places, pull out a chair and just write. It was amazing.
That's
Actually, that's
amazing.
kind of how I really got serious into writing my fantasy series. That's how it started.
Do you remember which hike it was? Or was it just like the series of them?
It was just a series, yeah. Like I had already started it before, but this was an opportunity for me to really make it into a practice as opposed to just something I dabbled in every once in a while.
Mm, how interesting.
Yeah, natural beauty, it helps.
Yeah, I suppose top of the mountain. It's a good thing to
Yeah,
find purpose and direction.
yeah, totally.
Yeah, awesome. Well, this has been great. Really appreciate this. Um,
Yeah, thanks for Derek. Yeah, me too.
if you would maybe just give a shout out to any other ways of people being able to connect with you that we haven't mentioned already. I know you did touch on Patreon. What do you got going on with the Patreon?
Yeah, I have a Patreon community. It was initially an opportunity for me to um, gather people who were interested in short fiction and podcast episodes. I haven't had an opportunity to do much of either, so I'm treating it as a kind of, do you know what's his name? Do you know a guy named Austin Kleon?
Mm-mm.
So
No.
he's a visual artist. He's got a book called Steal Like an Artist. He's got a series of books called
Oh, I've seen the book.
Yeah,
Yes.
there's a part of the series of Steal Like an Artist, Show Your Work, and Keep Going. I think those are the three books. He's a big proponent of practicing in public, which I think is a really good idea, and I haven't been doing a
Hmm.
lot of it as a kind of, not just as a motivational thing, but also it's like a glimpse into the craftsman's workshop. Kind of open the door and see what the artist is doing in the background as he's
Hmm.
tinkering. And since I've been trying to go deeper into the process of creating and not constantly be churning stuff out, which I had been doing a little bit in the past few years, the podcast, the Patreon is now the place where people can go and see me practicing in public, kind of
Hmm.
crafting the work before it comes out. And
Hmm.
it's also the place where I try out some of the stories live. Like I'll tell a story to a Zoom audience.
Hmm.
And it's not the same as being on stage and seeing people's faces, but it's close. It's a little bit more personal than just recording it and sending it out on a podcast. Not
Hmm.
as personal as sitting in a room with people and feeling their energy, but
Okay.
it's I've been doing a little bit of that. I'm going to be doing that as part of the Kickstarter. One of the tiers, you can sign up for 6 months worth of uh, live storytelling on Patreon. So you kind of get like a free trial of the Patreon if you want. So that's
Okay.
also something you can check out.
And is that like you have an idea for, let's say, like an epic fantasy, and as you
Well,
get the idea, you tell it, or is it a little bit more developed than that?
oh, the storytelling? No, it's Russian fairy tales.
Ah, okay.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's
wonderful.
it's me telling new stories that I haven't told yet.
Okay, awesome.
Yeah.
And then let's see, another thing that you do, obviously you're a speaker. So do you have any other speaking engagements upcoming?
Nothing in the immediate future, but there's a few
Okay.
that are kind of percolating. So
And then,
parishes have me over sometimes, and I've
oh,
talked
great.
to schools and that sort of thing.
And what about teaching? I know that you've been announcing different class options for
Yeah,
writers and others.
well, the big thing that I'm doing in terms of teaching is I've essentially founded together with St. Athanasius online college, which is it's a work of the Antiochian Archdiocese. We effectively established a year-long craft course for writers, not for aspiring writers, but for pre-professional writers. So this is
Hmm.
like early intermediate, and preferably for people who are just about ready to publish a book, and to put them through the ringer and really give them a very strong craft and business education in how to write. And it's we have some really great teachers. Jonathan Pajot is a teacher. Paul Kingsnor's a teacher.
Nice.
Catherine Hyde, who's a acquisitions editor at Ancient Faith, and a few others. And we've just admitted our second cohort a few weeks ago, and we're going to start with an in-person live retreat with them, or an in-person retreat with them in the summer. So that's something that I'm doing. I also, in conjunction with that, I have a community for writers that's all virtual, and I treat that as kind of ongoing training
Hmm.
for writers who want to be published. And the idea being that they can go into this online community, they can interact with each other, they can start creating that community that will then become their cohort when they become published, and maybe give them the rudiments in both writing and publishing to be able eventually to apply to St. Basil's, which is the class that I mentioned, which is more advanced. So I actually really enjoy teaching. Um, I've always liked it. I've always found it to be part of my calling. and which is one of the reasons why I live in upstate New York at the seminary here in Holy Trinity, where I teach music. So yeah,
Awesome. Well, thanks for providing that assistance, making it available for folks.
it really is a pleasure because there's a lot of talent out there, but people don't know where to go to get it honed. And unfortunately, most technical programs like MFAs, they don't actually teach you how to write well.
Hmm.
Um, Most MFAs, their dirty little secret is that they're training future MFA teachers.
Oh, oh no.
Yeah. So, and there's a lot of like gurus and things that tell you the way things have to be done. But
Mhm.
there again, there isn't this received tradition really about how you become a good writer. There's all kinds of different schools and all this sort of thing. But actually, writing is a fairly technical art. If you master the fundamentals, and the fundamentals are universal,
Mm.
no matter what kind of writing you do. They're universal because they reflect just the way people have been telling stories since the beginning. And by the way, those patterns are scriptural, which is an entirely different conversation. But
Ah,
if you can teach them in that
bookmark that
deep
one for
kind
next
of,
time.
yeah, maybe. But if you can get to a point where you can teach them that deep embodied way of doing things, then I think I've done. Then I feel like I've done something good. And honestly, like the talent out there is really high. So if we can get it honed and publishable, you're going to get a renaissance of published
Mhm.
Christian storytelling that's like inkling level. So I'm excited.
Inkling level.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And so to clarify, are you publishing self-published or are you working with another company?
So both. I self-publish my own work, but it's it's not quite what it sounds like. I actually have a publishing company that I've established through which I publish my own books
Mm.
because I you really do have to be writer, that's one persona,
Mhm.
publisher, it's a different persona. And if you mix those two things get complicated. But we are starting a next month I'm launching a new Substack which is called The Wood Between the Worlds, and it's connected
Yes.
to yeah,
Right.
and
Glad
it's
to hear it.
connected to a new publishing venture that's going to be a new publishing house for primarily speculative fiction, so sci-fi and fantasy, that's written in the tradition of the Inklings. And we have
Mm.
about 5 or 6 books in the pipeline. And they're really good. They're really good. So I'm
Awesome.
over the next few years, I'm going to be publishing a lot of new work, and I'm very excited about
All right. Glad you're getting into the Substack realm.
it. Slowly, slowly.
Fantastic. Yeah. All right. Baby steps. Yeah.
Yeah, don't want to do too
Okay.
much.
Deacon Nicholas, this has been great. I do have a private question, so I'll stop record and
Okay, thanks, Derek.
I will wish our listening audience a good day. And thanks for coming on. It's been great.
Thanks for having me. Always a pleasure.
Okay.